Great to be here.
Before we dive in, I want to just identify a few quick housekeeping items. For those of you who I don't know, I'm Patrick Oakford, Director of Worker Power and Economic Security here at Roosevelt. And as usual for our book clubs, we'll begin with a moderated conversation and then save about 15 to 20 minutes for audience Q&A at the end of the conversation. Uh, so, Aaron, before we dive in, I guess, to the heart and meat of your book and unpack kind of why wages have been stuck for so long and what a path forward might look like, I'm wondering if you can just share first a bit about kind of really what prompted you to write this book as someone who has been on really the cutting edge of labor economic research, particularly as it relates to minimum wage issues and policy engagement for so long, kind of why now for this book and who are you hoping picks it up and what do you want them to take away from it?
Yeah. So, I've been doing research on how wages are set and how different policies affect it for, over 2 decades now. For most of the time, I was writing for other economists and presenting the papers at journals and at seminars and conferences. But I sort of realized like that, in many ways, these questions that I'm trying to answer of why people get paid what they do is something that really touches everyone, most of us who work or know someone who do. And so I wanted to actually have this broader conversation, exactly like we're having here today. And to really try to understand why sometimes wages for so many people have just not grown enough. So for example, if we went back, since 1980, the economy overall grew by over 70%, became 70% more productive per hour of work. Okay, but at the same time, the pay for the typical worker grew by only around 20% or so over this period. So that gap between what a typical worker is making and what overall is being produced per hour of work, that gap didn't just sort of disappear. It went to folks at the top. And so this book is really for anyone who wants to understand why that happened and why hasn't pay grown like it should have and what we can do about it. Because fundamental point of the book is actually pretty straightforward, and that is American workers deserve a raise. And that the wage isn't a natural number, it's a negotiated outcome, which is shaped by employer power, by institutions, and by policy, including macroeconomic policy, as well as what sort of wage setting institutions we build. And so that means that for sort of 45-year divergence between this productivity and pay, was a matter of choice and it's also the good news is that it's reversible. And in fact, we have seen at times how we actually can see better wage growth. One thing that, is sort of the book talks about is that between 2019 and 2024, wage inequality actually fell in a very tight labor market. And that was actually an important lesson to keep in mind as we go forward. So again, that most American workers deserve a raise, and that we know how to do this, and that's a good thing. And the book is really it sort of tells the story of both where things went wrong and also where things can go right.
That's one of the things, I really love about your book is that it really digs in and kind of unpacks the conditions that have given rise to those trends of, decoupling productivity and wage growth and kind of the labor market dynamics that have really sustained them over the last few decades. And a key dynamic that you discuss that is driving wage setting today is monopsony power. And you write that a worker's pay is not about who they are, the skills that they hold, but about where they work. And so I was wondering if you could tell the audience a bit more about this dynamic and how wages are really being set differently across companies, even when they are in the same industry and for the same type of job. And, how has that contributed to wage suppression and inequality in the United States?
Yeah, so we're often taught that pay reflects who you are, right? your skills, your education, your experience. But the data actually says that it also reflects where you are. Your wage is roughly what it costs your employer to keep you from leaving. And that number is much lower than sometimes the textbooks assume. We can sort of start with some simple examples, right? So FedEx and UPS that deliver similar packages along similar routes, they actually have similar revenue per worker. But it turns out that 60%, around 60% of UPS workers earn more than $20 an hour versus only 40% at FedEx. Now, in a really competitive labor market, that gap shouldn't exist, but it has persisted for years. That's not just one example. You can take two other companies in the same industry, Walmart and Target. It turns out Target pays about 25% more than Walmart, despite actually having a lower revenue per worker. So these examples, of course, point to something that's not new. People have understood these or observed these for a while now. In fact, labor economists with sort of institutionalist mindset in the mid 20th century surveyed factories and sort of found the same kind of patterns. But they couldn't fully convince skeptics that maybe these pay gaps between companies are really hidden skill differences that observers are just not able to capture adequately. So really the game changer here was the availability of better data, in particular in the form of matched employer-employee records or administrative data that really helped sort of track nearly everyone in the labor market, millions of workers moving around from employer to employer. You can then track to see what happens to pay when the same worker changes companies. And this allows one to really get a much better handle on this question. And this is sort of like what economists have sort of been able to do starting in the late 1990s and especially in the 2000s. And that's really helped push our understanding of the labor market both empirically, but then also try to understand like why these type of differences are able to persist. Because the truth is that if you have a highly competitive market, these sort of gaps between companies cannot possibly exist. It just market would set the wage based on your skill, and that's it. And yet, as I argue in the book, that is not the way the economy actually works. In fact, employers have considerable amount of choice and power when it comes to setting wages. And the core reason is because the markets are not sort of competitive in the textbook sense. So it turns out, why? So the basic question people would typically ask is, well, if a company is underpaying workers, why wouldn't the workers just quit? And it turns out that when a company pays lower, it does have higher quit rate, but it turns out just not nearly enough that as needed to actually have a truly competitive market. So it turns out if a company pays about 10% less than its competitors, quits would rise maybe 15 to 20%. So it's just that gives considerable amount of market power to employers and allowing them to sort of decide how to set wages. And we've seen just an explosion of research on this topic in the last 10 years. I just finished a review of the literature on employer wage setting power for the Journal of Economic Literature. But these are all things that I talk about in less technical, I shouldn't say non-technical, but trying to really kind of, take it from not to sort of the people reading Journal of Economic Literature, but everyday folks about what kind of implications this type of monopsony power has, because it turns out that there's now a sort of a volume of evidence that really highlights convincingly that employers have quite a bit of monopsony power. And that's something that's really changed in economics. Even sort of 10 years ago or 15 years ago, if you asked economists about how much monopsony power is there in the American labor market, the answer you would have gotten is probably not that much. And that is not true today. And so this has been a very important part of understanding why there is wage suppression, why there's as much wage inequality as there is. This is an important part of that story.
And one of the things I really enjoyed is that the book not only, shows and discusses the big body of evidence that shows the, as you say, like the pervasiveness of this monopsony power, but you also have a rich discussion of the source of the market power of firms,
Yeah,
and are highlight practices that I think a lot of folks on this call are familiar with and that have really thankfully garnered greater attention in recent years. So, no poach agreements that are used in Silicon Valley and franchises, non-competes, and other anti-competitive practices. But you also underscore what you call the triumvirate of endemic. And it seems that you are kind of making the point that even if we could wave our policy wands and do away with non-competes and do away with no poach agreements, there is still this lingering source of really strong monopsony power. And so, would love to hear you talk a little bit more about those dynamics and how they
yeah.
affect workers' ability to leave these bad paying jobs, as you talked about, even when perhaps the quit rates aren't astronomically high, and kind of what is keeping those quit rates perhaps lower than what someone would intuitively think them to be?
Right. So I'm going to get to the triumvirate of endemic monopsony, but I'm going to start with sort of like the artificial part, the artifice of monopsony, because it's one of the more interesting stories is actually from the Silicon Valley. And so in Silicon Valley, Apple, Google, Adobe, Intel, and others secretly agreed not to recruit each other's engineers. And when Google recruiter contacted an Apple employee, Steve Jobs emailed Eric Schmidt, and Schmidt immediately fired that recruiter within the hour. And Jobs replied with a single smiley face, and that's it. And that this email, of course, was evidence in a federal case, which when it the Department of Justice opened an investigation, this illegal no poach agreement collapsed because it was just completely flat out illegal. And so research shows that that led to about a 6% increase in salaries. So this poach agreement was keeping wages down for, these are some of the most sought after workers in the world, right? And even there, this was a substantial thing that was a suppressing wages. What's interesting though is that one reason employers these in Silicon Valley resorted to a no poach agreement was because California bars another device, and that's non-competes. So non-competes are, basically where you're signing away your right to go work for some other competing company in a period like 6 months or a year or even more after you leave your position. Now, historically, these were sometimes used to protect certain types of sort of trade secrets that may affect the competitiveness and the product market. But it just turns out that these are used widely for jobs where there possibly couldn't be such trade secrets. And this includes hairdressers or camp counselors. And by 2016, about half of the franchise agreements in McDonald's were barred hiring a worker from another McDonald's, for example. So these are ways in which companies actually build monopsony power. But here's your point, Patrick, that even if you tomorrow by some stroke of miracle just banned every one of these artificial sources of monopsony, and by the way, we should. And speaking of non-competes, the Biden administration had in Lena Khan had tried to actually had implemented, in fact, announced a rule that would have barred these, but now under the new administration, that is not being pursued. But we should absolutely, make it use regulation and antitrust to reduce the scope of some of these practices. But even if you get rid of all of it, there's endemic sources of monopsony power, meaning there's just the nature of the work process is such that it is very, very unlikely to get anywhere near sort of a perfectly competitive ideal of a labor market. And here sort of I talk about in the book three sources of monopsony power. So concentration is the first one. And this basically is sort of the simplest idea, is that there just maybe not as many competing employers as we think there are. And what's interesting is that sort of research shows that the average American labor market is about as concentrated as having roughly three equal size employers. So very interesting work by Ioana Marinescu and co-authors sort of shows this. And, there's lots of examples. So I talk about in the book, for instance, ski resorts. So Vail Resorts, Altera and Powder have bought up a bunch of ski resorts, and these have become very concentrated. So not just in product market, but also in terms of the labor markets. Petrollers who, once played independent resorts against each other now face basically a single employer. And that has led to some tensions. For example, in 2024, Park City Petrollers had a strike, and they ended up getting a raise. But this is exactly shows that the importance of collective action when you have this type of concentration. And I know we'll sort of come back to this issue later, but concentration is one part of it only, because even in very thick urban labor markets, which may not be as concentrated, we still have very strong evidence of substantial monopsony power. And here, the two other key issues are important to keep in mind. One is that searching for a job is costly. We call it search frictions in economics, that finding a job while holding another is exhausting. You send resumes and interviews and rejections, so it turns out workers who are paid 10% lower end up spending about 5% more time searching. So yes, they search more, but not tremendously more. And on top of that, workers often underestimate their outside options, which creates sort of a vicious cycle where bad jobs create their own supply. So search frictions are an important component of why the labor market sometimes is not as competitive. And then there's the idea, the point that jobs are not all valued the same by different people. So a job across the town with the same title isn't, the same if your commute goes down by, from 5 minutes to 40 minutes. That's the simplest example. Or your kid's daycare is nearby versus far away. So these sort of attachments give employers some leverage, and as a result, all of these things combined together means that even in thick urban labor markets, that we have considerable amount of monopsony power. The bottom line, meaning employers have choices. Employers can set pay to a certain extent, and they do. And sometimes you see very different outcomes of how those pay setting actually occur. And in the book, I talk about both how the advent of certain type of business practices really, starting from it turns out when companies started hiring CEOs that have a business school degree, pay went down. And pay went down and profits went up and managerial pay went up. And so this really happened in the 80s and 90s, and that sort of contributed to increased inequality. Also, new companies that expanded and came to being, like, for example, Walmart, really not bound by some of the prior wage setting practices and countervailing power, like, for instance, unions. They chose a very different strategy of paying lower wages. And these are, again, choices that companies have made, but there are also choices that go the other direction. For instance, starting in 2014, a lot of major retailers actually introduced voluntary pay standards. Part of the reason they did so was because of public pressure and attempts at union organizing. This combined with the fact that we had started to have a tighter labor market led to raising pay at the bottom. Several, maybe 3 million or so workers saw substantial pay growth because these companies introduced voluntary minimum standards in both retail sector as well as in the financial services. So again, this goes to show that companies have a degree of choice, and they have exercised that choice sometimes in quite different ways. And as a society, we can guide that process. And this is a really key sort of argument that I try to make in the book.
Yeah, I want to take the thread a little bit on your point around companies beginning to kind of hire CEOs that come from business schools. I thought this conversation in the book was fascinating and rich because I think often, progressives have made the case, right, that the rise of, the shareholder supremacy has led to, a reduction in wages. And I think skeptics of this say, oh, this is just rhetoric and you're creating this like business school boogeyman.
Yeah,
And you have really provided deep research and discussion of not only that this one indeed has happened, but I think what's really um, enjoyable about this conversation is that you are really making the point that despite the magnitude of monopsony power and despite its pervasiveness, what ultimately determines the wages is that the pressure that employers face when determining pay. And I think you really highlight how the countervailing forces is one of them is the idea of the social norms in setting wages.
right.
And you have this rich conversation of kind of how the confluence of deunionization, slack labor markets, and eroding of labor standards has given rise to this low pay social norm. And you bring in that the discussion of CEOs that are coming from business schools. So would love if you could kind of dig into that a little bit more and perhaps explain that research and kind of share how that culture has been able to come to be.
Yeah. So in the book, I sort of go back to early or 20th century, because if we want to understand what happened in the 80s and 90s in terms of pay suppression, we have to go back to see how a better wage standard was built, because it did erode in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, but we actually had built a wage standard. And that really sort of story goes back to, of course, the 1930s and during the Depression. And this was the story of sit down strikes at Flint, Michigan. It was story also of under the Roosevelt administration, who, of course, the Roosevelt Institute is named for, helped pass the Wagner Act, and which really allowed, for the first time in America, workers a right to unionize, passed the minimum wage, federal minimum wage, as a Fair Labor Standards Act. So the combination of changes in policies and organizing, and also during the Second World War, the War Labor Board, all of these really led to a very sharp reduction in inequalities. Economists have called this the Great Compression. And this Great Compression really was a critical part of that was unionization, because we saw that increased unionization had a very lasting impact on raising wages at the bottom and the middle. And this sort of I talk about the Treaty of Detroit, which was a term coined by Fortune magazine to talk about an agreement between the United Auto Workers and the major auto manufacturers. But it was much broader than that, because it really set the pattern for pay setting, throughout the whole economy. And I talk about the evidence of exactly how important those spillovers are, and how economists have actually studied and documented the positive spillover effects of union wage setting. But these all started to erode, because over this period, deunionization was occurring, leading to, again, fall in wages. And so importantly, what the story here is that, monopsony power at a certain level is always there. And you can definitely try to reduce it, and we should. But really, what you also need is a way to set wages to countervail that power. And the key player there historically has been unions. And here interestingly and unfortunately, the particularities of how union organizing happens and union negotiations happen in America as compared to some of our peer countries has also played a role. Because here's the thing, in the United States, union or we have what we call decentralized collective bargaining. That means that you organize company by company, sometimes shop by shop, and you strike deals with individual employers. So if you're, union member, you are bound, you get a wage that's negotiated. If you're not a union member, you do not. That seems like the standard thing to do, but it turns out that's not at all standard. In fact, most of our high income peer countries have what's called sectoral bargaining. Okay, so sectoral bargaining, that's where basically you would have employers actually agree to a contract, and that would apply to everyone in that sector, whether you're a union member or not. And we can talk more about this, but the bottom line is that as union density fell in the United States, it also meant union coverage. How many jobs are covered by contract fell pretty much lockstep. And this exposed basically sort of like what the economy looks like if you don't have that countervailing power, because what you're left with is basically a very highly monopolistic labor market where employers over the 80s and 90s took a variety of steps to take advantage of. This includes outsourcing of certain jobs to lower wage contractors. It includes changing the wage setting strategies themselves, be it, for example, hiring a CEO with a business school degree. The list goes on, but there's a lot of ways in which employers really changed how they paid because they could, and because there were no other guardrails that would have protected us. And that's really kind of the story of why wages diverged from productivity and why wages grew so unequal over this period.
Turning then more, I guess, to kind of digging into the, what can be done to increase worker power and kind of that countervailing force to monopsony power. As you've already mentioned, sectoral bargaining kind of in the vein of a European model. You have a rich discussion of that in the book, but you also really touch upon kind of the wage board structure, and was curious if you could explain a little bit more about kind of the Australian model, how it works, and why it may be a promising approach for the United States.
Yeah. So really quick, just sort of a few things terminologically. We talk about union membership or density, and then we can also talk about union coverage. And these two things in the United States, like I sort of alluded, are pretty much the same thing. So you have 10% workers who are union members, 10% of jobs are covered by a union contract. Well, it turns out that France also has about 10% union members, but like 95% union coverage, because most jobs have to pay at least as much as negotiated sectorally at the national level with an employer association and unions. So we don't have that in this country. There are different ways, even within Europe, there are different, sort of ways of actually organizing this sectoral bargaining. But the bigger point is that they're usually through collective bargaining. Now, in the United States, if we wanted to experiment with some type of sectoral standards, we may try to do it at the state level, but you're going to quickly run into one issue, which is that you can't have labor law at the state level for most workers who are covered by the National Labor Relations Act. So as a result, you can't do collective bargaining at a sectoral level in Massachusetts, for example, except, for example, for workers like gig workers who are not covered by the NLRA. But what you can do is you can actually set wage floors for different types of sectors. And the interesting example of this comes from Australia, because in Australia, similar to the United States, and union collective bargaining is done at a decentralized level. But what they have on top of that is a national system of wage boards or wage standards, literally about 900 or so pay standards that apply to industry and occupation and experience. Depending on this, you're going to have to pay at least a certain amount. Employers can pay more than that, but they can't pay less. This is relevant because something like this can be done at a state level in the United States. And here's the thing, and as I talk about in the book, it's actually already being done in some cases in states. So, for example, nursing home workers in Minnesota have a sectoral standard that you have to pay at least a certain amount to different types of workers in the nursing homes. Hospitals in California have a hospital specific standard. uh, in childcare workers in the state of Washington are soon going to have a similar standard as well. So we're starting to see, these are early days, and there's other examples like fast food minimum wage in California as well. These all sort of point to the possibility that we can actually raise wages. We can do this even at the state level, and we don't have to wait to fix the politics in Washington, D.C., before we can do any of this. So I think that state level experimentation on sectoral standards could be quite important, game changer when it comes to actually raising wages, not just for those at the bottom. And we haven't talked very much about the minimum wage, but that's an important part of the story. But we can go beyond the minimum and set standards for folks in the middle. So to rebuild the middle class, I think sectoral standards can play an important role.
Since this is a group that I know enjoys kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of the policy details, and clearly one of the advantage of, more sectoral wage board approaches you're suggesting at the state level is that it would reach workers that aren't just the lowest, but rather, higher and closer to the middle of the income distribution. If the United States and states started, adopting these types of models, how do you envision, or what is kind of your, at least one idea of how to actually set the wage level for occupations and various occupations and industries, and kind of how would that ensure you're reaching more workers beyond even very strong minimum wage proposals that we're starting to hear today,
Right.
25, $30 an hour?
Yeah. So, in the book, I sort of lay out some simple calculations, and I've sort of done more work on this. We put out a sort of a report recently on setting wages using wage sectoral standards. But the idea is that you can, for example, what if you set standards at the state level for different industry and occupation groups at like 2/3 of the current median wage, just as an example, right? So it's going to differ place by place. But I show that if you were to do that, that would lead to substantial wage growth at the bottom and the middle. Going up to maybe 60th or 65th percentile of the distribution. So you're really reaching the middle, which you would just absolutely not do from a minimum wage unless it actually went up to the median wage, which would sort of be very sort of high by variety of standards. But the point is that I argue is that we don't have to do that. We don't, because we have more than one tool at our disposal. And in particular, we can actually set wages to basically get rid of the lowest paying jobs. And what I mean by get rid of, by raising standards of the lowest paying jobs. Those are exactly the jobs that sort of, the presence of monopsony power allows wages to get pulled down at the bottom. And we've seen this, especially in periods where we have very slack labor market, meaning the unemployment rate is higher. That's exactly when these sort of low paying jobs build up. We saw this happen after the financial crisis, for example, where it took nearly 10 years for us to really recover the labor market. And during this period, employers basically faced very little pressure to raise wages, and some employers just really existed only because they pay so little. And what a sectoral standard like that does is it really pushes against that. So it prevents the sort of like the tail at the bottom to drag down wages. And what you want to do is you want to sort of push that much more towards the middle. And when you do that, you're going to raise wages, and you're going to do that throughout, the economy. So not just for jobs that are usually affected by the minimum wage, like fast food or retail, but also, nursing homes and other, education, childcare, other sectors that are more sort of towards the middle, construction. And so these are exactly the ways that which we can actually help rebuild the middle class in this country. And that's sort of the argument that I lay out in the book.
You also have, as you mentioned earlier, kind of identified, there are a handful of places where folk states are already kind of using these models and advancing them. And I'm curious for your kind of thoughts on how they have played out, and really in particular the case of the California Fast Food Wage Board. This was obviously
Yeah.
delivered a very meaningful wage increase to a very low wage workforce. But it has also been more recently, in some views, less effective at moving to the second increase, right? As time the board hasn't met again. And so curious, is this a political quirk, or do you think there are really like policy design weaknesses that folks should be taking to heart and thinking about changes to that type of model as they are moving forward and perhaps trying to advance that in similar sectors in other states or even other sectors as well?
Yeah, I mean, at a certain level, of course, when we are designing institutions, we need to think carefully about how to sort of make them work better, and part of it is a political decision. So in the case of the California fast food, so just for listeners, like what this does is it set a minimum wage $20 for large fast food chains. So these are national sort of larger chains that have to pay this minimum wage. Now, there were a lot of skepticism about this policy, and there were some, reasonable concerns that maybe because this had sort of only applied to one part of the labor market, the low wage labor market, maybe that gave some incentives for companies to try to relabel workers, like maybe you may outsource your delivery workers because then they wouldn't have to be paid this minimum wage and so on. So there's some legitimate concerns, but as it turns out, though, that in when the minimum wage was implemented, it led to very strong wage increase, not surprisingly for the fast food sector. It led to a enormous reduction in turnover. So these jobs just became a lot better, and people, quits fell by a third, which was just really compared to most other minimum wage increases, is a lot more reduction. In general, minimum wages tend to reduce quits, but as these jobs become better, but this was just a lot more so. But then what about jobs? And it turns out it had very little impact on jobs, which of course is interesting because this is genuinely a high minimum wage. It's the highest minimum wage in the US, but I was actually also, when I was in Sweden like a month ago, I actually just was curious and figured out actually compared to their median wage, this is a higher minimum wage compared to the California median wage than the Swedish fast food minimum wage. So it's a genuinely high. And even here, we basically don't see evidence that it led to any sort of visible job loss, which is consistent with a broad set of literature, of course, on this topic. That's also really changed, as I talk about in the book. I think views of economists, as we have done, as we've seen more data coming on this question. I think economists have changed their minds, which is a good thing. And I think it's much easier to understand why jobs don't disappear from a higher minimum wage, including one like in California fast food, when you actually understand that the labor market has a considerable amount of market power, monopsony power. But in terms of what I sort of argue in the book is that I would probably put more emphasis on pilots that are more sort of more in the middle, because I think in some ways the minimum wage itself is sort of like a tool for fast food workers. I would probably, sort of think about, especially in the health, social services, and education sector. These are also much more tied to the local economy, and also important places to build wages towards the middle. I think, for example, the nursing home example in Minnesota, as well as the childcare example in Washington, are quite important. But I think in my experience, a key thing that really is important is to bring parties together and have sort of like employers and workers representatives sort of be able to hash out something that works for everyone. This is eminently doable. It's done around the world all the time. And it's something that I think also can reduce sort of employer hostility to unions. Because if it turns out that you're going to have a standard that you have to pay, even if you don't have a union, then you're going to be less hostile to having unionization occur. Because at this point, employers in the United States are extremely hostile anytime there's a union organizing drive. And I think finding ways of changing that is an important part of the story.
I could keep asking you questions for another hour, but I don't want to monopolize everyone's time here. So I will open it up to questions from participants if you'd like to raise your hand or just drop your question in the chat. Um, we have one question in the chat already, kind of around monopsony power, and kind of the question is, monopsony power, as we've been talking about, has significant impact on suppressing wages. The question is kind of what are the patterns that you see in research related to kind of other forms of compensation, whether that's health coverage, retirement contributions, and so forth.
Yeah, so I think in general, of course, in the United States, we rely on our jobs for healthcare. Again, that's not it's common in a lot of other high income countries, but that is an important part of it. Now, one of the things that sort of we find in our research is that the presence of monopsony power doesn't just distort wages, but it also tends to distort what type of fringe benefits are paid, and not just simply lower, but both will be typically lower when employers have market power. But it is also the case that certain types of benefits are particularly less likely to be provided, and this is another important thing to think about, especially when it comes to healthcare. And that's one of the lessons. This is why we already know that it's probably better to have healthcare not be tied to your job, but this is yet another reason for that.
Absolutely. Um, Again, invite anyone who has questions to please either drop them into the chat or just feel free to raise your hand. We'll call on you at this time. Mike, was that a physical raising of hand with a
But there's like an official one first, so I can
okay,
I can defer my like waving at the camera.
sounds good. Austin, go ahead.
Hi, Patrick. Thank you so much for hosting this to connect with this book, and thank you so much, Aaron, for taking the time. My question is in the chat, but I just speaking up to talk about it is thank you during your remarks on how you think states can continue to innovate despite the state of the NLRA and the obstacles it represents. I personally work with Greater Boston cities and towns, so I have a similar question about what you think municipalities can do at the local level. So, do you
Yeah.
have any favorite ideas for them?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. So, we have, of course, seen cities enact minimum wages. That really started in sort of like with Seattle, as sort of one of the first major cities. San Francisco actually was the first city besides DC to raise its minimum wage back in 2004. But then really Seattle kind of kicked off the fight for 15. movement, etc. So cities have played an important role. Now, in a lot of places, some states, cities are barred from having any wage setting. They're preempted. But in other states, they're not. And in those cases, thinking about sort of sectoral standards, I wouldn't probably suggest like very small areas to necessarily, be the natural starting place, but large cities can certainly, or larger areas together can certainly, I think make sense to try and experiment with exactly the kind of sectoral setting that we talked about. And I mean, especially in the beginning, just like with the minimum wages, the cities ended up sort of led the way of the sort of the higher minimum wages that emerged in the 2010s. So I could see a similar type of pattern where initial explorations and experimentation at the local level could be an impetus for broader statewide actions as well. So yeah, very happy to chat more about anything in Massachusetts along these lines.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the question, Austin. Mike, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, can I do my actually
Yeah.
moving? Hey, sorry to join late. Recent traveling seems to have made Zoom very mad at me, but these things happen. I was actually really curious when you were talking about the knock-on effects. It definitely seems like there would be big benefits in places where wage boards are hitting a large fraction of the low wage sector, where you get knock on across different industries and different occupations. And I sort of wanted to tie that back to where I thought you were going earlier with Great Recession stuff of back when we were seeing upskilling of jobs, in the sense that job postings were we would like you to have a master's degree to drive this
Yeah,
forklift.
exactly.
And I'm especially interested in this in terms of how we think about using these regulations to make labor markets more efficient at processing, churn between jobs and workers in an era where it seems like AI is doing a lot of that processing and maybe not as efficiently from the worker and employer perspective as from the corporate headquarters perspective.
Yeah, so a few things. One of the things I talk about in the book is sort of the importance of a tight labor market. What it does is to reallocate workers towards higher productivity companies. And so this is exactly what stopped. This was called the job ladder. So basically the process by which workers leave the lowest paid companies towards better ones. This just kind of died out. And so what that allowed companies to do then is to basically increase whatever credentials are necessary, even if they're not really, important. But the point is that you could afford to be more picky as an employer. And one thing to do to fight that is what I argue in the book is the macro policy, is that you really need to really commit to running the labor market hot is a really important thing to do. But beyond that, the other thing that also reallocates workers towards the top is an actual wage standard. For example, the minimum wage, or in this case, the sectoral standards, it will tend to increase, sort of workers going towards better, higher paid, more productive companies often. And so this process has, as I sort of argue, as it's sort of a double dividend, that it actually is in some ways, in an important way, it makes the market more effective. It actually makes the market more efficient, which is maybe contrary to sometimes what we think, that anytime the government comes in, it's making the market work less good. But actually, in the presence of market power, these type of standards actually increase the efficiency of the labor market, not decrease it. And that's an important thing to keep in mind as we sort of make arguments. Like there's not an argument sort of like, oh, there's a trade-off between sort of distributive concerns and efficiency concerns. In fact, sometimes they go hand in hand, which is good news. And this sort of harks back to an argument that really was developed in Sweden called the Rehn-Meitner model. And it exactly made this argument the same way that basically both through macro policy, but also through wage standards, in this case in unions, will actually lead to the economy to be operating at a more productive point than it otherwise would be. And so this is, I think, an important thing to keep in mind for those on the left, that you don't need to concede the idea that, well, I don't care about efficiency. If it hurts workers, I will we can be a little less efficient to help workers. I mean, I think that's true, but sometimes you're actually not even going to do that. Sometimes you're actually going to make the market work better by restructuring it. And that's, I think, an important lesson to keep in mind.
Would welcome others to jump in with any questions they have. And I think we have one here that just got dropped in the chat, so I will quickly look at this. So the question is around how bargaining power depends not on the labor market institutions, but also on the broader economic and political context. How do you think pressure from foreign governments fits into that framework? And then provides an example around Trump administration's pressure automakers to relocate production or expand investments in the US. Could those types of threats weaken workers' bargaining power in countries like Mexico by increasing fears of losing jobs or investment? So I think kind of really just curious for thoughts of how do these dynamics play out across borders here?
So I think there are a couple of important things here. One is sort of, I guess, if you just step back and say, well, what's the role of international trade in all of this? And there, I think if you went back 25 years ago, I think most economists were just like pretty much unified, like saying, no, trade is absolutely not just a win-win overall, but there isn't really much evidence that it would actually have any sort of negative impacts. So one of the things that we've actually learned is that trade did have some, mixed impact. On the one hand, it may have allowed us to get cheaper products, but on the other hand, it actually did have a negative impact on wages and employment in certain areas. And the part of that, I would argue, would tend to weaken workers' bargaining power. So then, in light of that, what should you do? I mean, that is one reason why supposedly we have all these tariffs. But this also highlights that just because there's a problem doesn't mean every solution to it is a good one. And so I think that, I would argue that, the current tariff structure is not really amenable to even the goals that it sets out to do. But more than that, I would say, anytime you have a choice, I think it's best if you sort of take an approach which is not based on sort of, beggar thy neighbor, because, if there are absolutely good ways that you can raise workers' bargaining power, not just in one country at the expense of the other, but across different places. And I think this is where the kinds of things that I highlight are ones to sort of build power, here for U.S. workers that wouldn't be sort of through, putting, sort of negative pressure on workers elsewhere. But there are, different approaches that have been, taken with putatively to increase workers' bargaining power. But I think that fundamentally using strategies that that are sort of like work not just only in one place, but generally are probably preferred.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Any other last questions from folks before we close out? Perfect. Then, Aaron, I may, kind of just to pull us back a little bit here in the last few minutes, we are in a moment where I think people are hungry for policy ideas that does exactly what you kind of argue in the book, which is that workers are long overdue for meaningful pay raises. So kind of as policymakers look at the menu of options from a much stronger federal minimum wage to continuing to fight for state minimum wage increases, to wage boards, to attempting to advance sectoral bargaining as NLRA is being gutted and may fall, kind of where do you place your chips in terms of bets of saying, it's this combination of policies that would have the biggest impact for workers in the short term, even
Yeah,
while we keep thinking about what the ultimate dream that we want to build towards is?
I think in the longer run, aiming to reform the National Labor Relations Act and moving towards a sectoral bargaining is absolutely a useful sort of guiding lodestar for us in terms of policies. But while we wait for that, and we should at the state level absolutely experiment with sectoral standards. And we're going to learn things from it. And I'm not going to, and part of what I argue in the book is that not that we know everything, exactly how to do it, but we're going to learn by trying. And that trying is actually an important part of the story. And frankly, it's exciting because it means that we don't have to just sort of wait around until everything has been solved at the national level, because who knows when that might happen. At the same time, the other really important part that I hope we all remember is the importance of really the macroeconomic policy, because really there's a tight labor market is a very important antidote to employer monopsony power. And it's been a painful period of high inflation in the after the pandemic. But I think it's an important lesson also to remember that we actually made sure jobs were recovered much faster than, for instance, what we did after the financial crisis, and it's an important part of the story because it led to about a reversal of about a third of the increase in wage inequality that had built up over decades was erased. Now, I don't know if that lasts or not. It depends on what we do. But that is a success story. And I know it's hard to understand that as a success when it occurred in the context of lots of painful things, including high inflation. But the importance of actual full employment, I just cannot, say enough about. So I think keeping that in mind at the national policy discussion is critical. At the same time, state level experimentation on wage boards can really help, again, in our effort to give workers a raise and rebuild the middle class.
That is, I think, a perfect note for us to end on. This has been a really enjoyable conversation. Thank you so much, Aaron, for joining us. And for folks on the line, if you've enjoyed this, there's much more in Aaron's book, The Wage Standard. So encourage you to pick it up. I have a feeling this is one that will be a go-to resource for lots of policy folks for years to come as they keep developing and doing exactly what you suggested, which is learn by trying. So thank you again so much, and hope everyone has a great rest of your afternoon. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.